Thanks for coming back. I hope you had a good lunch. I'm Dominic Rasool. I'm part of our team here based in Europe. I work with our business development and client engagement team. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker in a fireside chat, Oscar Rueda from CCS Plus and South Pole. Oscar's going to be talking to us about how to enable CDR adoption through policy. So, Oscar, without much further ado, please come on stage and deliver your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Let's check this. Good, it's working well. Hello, everyone. So in this presentation, I will focus the discussion in a few minutes with Dominic on how policy can enable the responsible adoption of removals. But before doing this, I will provide you with a little bit overview of what you need to know before jumping into this discussion. It would have been great that everyone joined the previous session with Professor McDowell, where he provided a great introduction to the topic. But I will just try to do this in 1 minute instead of several minutes. So we will start with the definition of what is carbon removals in the context of CCS. To make things as simple as possible, there are two key considerations for removals to happen in the CCS context. And one of them is where the CO2 comes from. And the point is that it has to come from the atmosphere, either directly or indirectly. And then the CO2 has to be stored permanently. So this is the case, for instance, for storage in geological formations or also in permanent products or materials, as also previously discussed. We will go a little bit into the details of direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which are the two cases for CCS. So why are we even talking about carbon removal? As you can imagine, it is much easier to capture the CO2 from a point source, from a fossil fuel plant, than capturing diluted from the air. It's more expensive, takes more energy. Some people might think it doesn't make sense. The reason for doing this is because we will need it. At some point in the future, sooner or later, we will need carbon removal to neutralize hard-to-abate emissions from sectors where it is extremely expensive to capture CO2. You may think that a price of 500 per ton of carbon removal is very expensive now, but the emissions that it is going to help us neutralize are in the range of even more than 1,000 per ton in some cases. So the challenge here is that while there is a lot of discussion already in countries on how to reduce emissions, there are plans already by countries on how to combine energy efficiency, renewable energy to reduce emissions. There is still a lot of uncertainty on how to achieve the carbon removals that we will need. And the problem is that the options that we have are widely diverse. Sometimes it feels that we are comparing apples to oranges, as Professor McDowell previously explained. The options that we have come with a huge baggage of things besides carbon removal. Yes, all of them can remove carbon removal. They can do it with very different storage times, but they also have many diverse implications. For instance, conventional methods on land, such as afforestation, reforestation, planting trees. This is something good to do. It can be good for the environment, but they can only store the CO2 for decades or hundreds of years if everything goes well. On the other hand, we have technological solutions like BECCS or direct air capture, which can capture the CO2 for tens of thousands of years. This is several orders of magnitude more than conventional methods on land. However, they come with implications related to ensuring the sustainability of biomass for BECCS, for instance, and also getting around this challenge of energy use for direct air capture. So let's dive a little bit deeper into those two cases, which are the ones that interest us. First of all, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The principle is simple. The plants, the crops, they capture CO2 as they grow through photosynthesis. Then the CO2 gets stored in the plants in the form of carbon. And then we use those plants as feedstock to produce energy. But instead of simply releasing the CO2 back to the atmosphere, as it commonly happens in current applications of bioenergy, we capture the CO2 and store it permanently in geological formations or materials. So this, in principle, is a really exciting idea. It has the added benefit that besides capturing CO2, you can produce large amounts of energy. The energy potential varies by technology. The main challenge that bioenergy with carbon storage has is sustainable biomass sourcing. This is a big challenge. It's not an unsurmountable challenge, but it's the most critical aspects to get BECCS right. Direct air capture is extremely expensive now, as you may know. However, it is one of the most promising carbon removal methods in the future because it has two main advantages. One of them is that its transparency and accountability is probably the highest among the different carbon removal methods options that we have. And the second one, and very important, is that it is less obviously constrained by biophysical limits, such as land use or things like biomass availability. So in principle, if we overcome the energy challenge, we can scale up DAX to a very, very large scale that only DAX can achieve. So to put things into context, how policy or how different types of markets are looking at these two carbon removal technologies, I'll give you 2 points of references. The first one is from the voluntary carbon markets. Essentially, what the SBTi is telling us is that you can use only permanent removal methods to neutralize hard-to-abate emissions. And the reason for this is that once you put CO2 in the atmosphere from fossil fuels, it will have an impact on the climate for thousands of years, even 200,000 years is the approximate. So the closest options that can provide you a close like-for-like compensation for those emissions are options like DECCS, DAX, BECCS, or enhanced weathering, for instance. The other temporal solutions can play a role, but they will not be suitable to compensate for fossil fuel emissions. And the second point of reference that I want to mention is the carbon removal certification framework in the EU. As you may know, among the very few technologies that they are considering, DAX and BECCS are the center, and they are probably the ones that are going to move faster when developing the methodologies needed for quantify and certify the mitigation outcomes. I think this slide summarizes very nicely some of the discussion that we had earlier, like what is the potential to scale up markets? Should the government pay for this? Should we let voluntary carbon markets do the job? Should compliance market come in? So in principle, this is what you can expect, at least at the beginning and at the end. In the beginning, it's really government support through subsidies, technology development, which has happened in the last few years or in the last 2 decades, let's say. This has helped us bring the technology to a certain stage and then already have some commercial demonstrations. But now the question is, to what point should government support? In the long term, the only way to, well, not the only way, but one more certain way to ensure that technologies do get adopted and not relying only on voluntary carbon markets will be compliance markets. This is something like incorporating carbon removals in the ETS is one option. But in the meantime, this is not happening, for instance, until after 2030, very likely. And in the meantime, it's really the voluntary carbon markets and probably international markets, the ones who can help bridge this implementation gap. We can go a little bit into the details, and if you have any questions, afterwards we can look a little bit closer into each one of them. And this is my last slide before going into the discussion with Dominic. We'll discuss a couple of points, and then we will open up to discussion for everybody. So what does it take to deploy carbon removals responsibly? And I will focus only on 3 principles. And even those 3 principles that I have, the first 2 may seem contradictory because we are saying avoid relying too much on carbon removals, prioritize emission reductions. And then at the same time, we're telling policymakers, we're telling governments to still proactively plan, proactively deploy carbon removals. The reason for this is that there is no substitution for emission reductions. We should prioritize it as much as possible. It also makes economical sense because removals are very expensive at the moment and there are a lot of low-hanging fruits. However, we need to start deploying today the carbon removals that we will need in the future. The scale of the industry is enormous. It's pretty much like running the oil and gas industry in reverse in 2050. So the challenge is huge. And this is one part of the mitigation puzzle that we cannot really afford to get wrong. For instance, carbon removal is very controversial for various reasons, some very good reasons. But despite its limitations, its wide implications, it is still one option that helps us tackle the root cause of global warming, which is high CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, because it directly tackles the concentration of CO2. So this is a step that we cannot really afford to get wrong. But to get it right, we need to start now, and we have to start right. So developing removals responsibly is also developing it proactively and rapidly as needed. And the last point is an obvious point. We have to make sure that we do this with a high quality, with high environmental integrity, to make sure that we don't create bigger problems than the one that we have already at hand. So I'll be very happy to go on with this discussion, first with Dominic, and then we open up with everyone. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for that, Oscar. That was quite comprehensive, but I wanted to find out from you, first of all, I've got about 5 questions here. The first one is a pretty obvious one. If you can elaborate on the need to tackle residual emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a good question that I think we haven't touched upon today. We have spoken a lot about we need to neutralize hard-to-abate emissions, but one big challenge that we have today is that there is very little clarity on what constitutes hard-to-abate emissions, what is residual emissions. For instance, recent academic research shows that what countries consider as residual emissions dramatically changes from one country to another one. So the definition of residual emissions is not clear, and even less clear, as you can imagine, is the quantification, how much it is in reality. The numbers are anywhere between 10 and 30% of the total emissions that countries have as residual emissions. And as you can imagine, if you don't clearly define, if you don't have a robust, consistent definition of residual emissions and you don't quantify properly what you have to compensate for, there is a good chance that we will leave a lot of low-hanging fruits, a lot of money on the table for not questioning in the first place what constitutes residual emissions. There are a lot of opportunities, for instance, in the agricultural sector, just to name one case.
Okay, thanks. And what can be done to support CDR from the supply side? I mean, hasn't the EU done enough in terms of supporting R&D, regulations, etc.?
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot that has been done, especially in the EU and the US. It was interesting to see this morning the perspective that we see from the US, for instance, that is shifting from support on research and development to support more the creation of markets, to creation of this economy. So there has been definitely progress. There are the obvious opportunity areas, for instance, the one that Chris mentioned today from the International Energy Agency. Sorry if I got the name wrong.
Carl, no?
Carl,
yeah.
Sorry. See, with the short name. And he mentioned, for instance, that it is critical to reduce the lead times, the project development times, to achieve the goals that we set for Europe, for instance. There was also this discussion from the cement industry of what it takes to develop projects on time. But there are also some other less obvious policy considerations that are not being discussed and that can have a dramatic impact on the supply potential, especially of DACs and BECs. And those are, for instance, the potential in the agricultural sector to make it more efficient. At the moment, we rely on a set of products that use a lot of land. If we tackle this with sound policies, I don't have a recipe to do this, but the thing is that we are using land extremely inefficient in the food sector. There is a way to get things better, to do it also while improving the health, the sustainability, various goals. And this can dramatically increase the potential, for instance, of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Another measure that I can tell you that can have a dramatic impact is unlocking international cooperation as well. We heard this morning also that one of the main challenges that we have now is we have seen a lot of progress, but a lot of the progress has been in developed countries, in Europe, the US, etc. But then we will need a lot of CCS and also other types of technologies in developing countries. So at the moment, there is very little cooperation or basically not a plan to use, for instance, Article 6.2, which is international cooperation, bilateral cooperation between countries. And this could be extremely useful, particularly for the case of removals. For instance, for the case, and for removals, not only to happen in other countries on behalf of those countries, but also for those projects to be implemented in other countries, but then rich countries could pay for those projects, for instance. In the case of removals, it could be an option. For emission reductions, it's not possible because if you have a power plant here in Europe, you cannot outsource the emission reductions. But for removals, really, it doesn't matter where the emission removals happen. And at the moment, this is a wide space that hasn't been explored in the US or in the EU, even with their very pioneering policies.
Okay. Sort of like a CDM for removals.
Exactly. And the Article 6.2 is precisely the CDM 2.0 in a way. Yeah. The main improvements that it has is that it has more robust rules, avoiding the double counting issue. It is still under development. It's at the very early stages. It is already working for some set of technologies. Carbon capture and storage, also carbon capture and storage-based removals face still some technical challenges. So it will be very sound for policymakers. Even if they don't plan to rely on international carbon markets, I think they shouldn't rely to a large extent on international carbon markets. But at the very least, they should consider establishing already the frameworks, the processes, which, as you know, take a lot of time to put into place. And then in the future, they will leave the door open to, and that could help them overcome many challenges of BECS and NACs.
Interesting. What can be done to sort of foster demand across market types? Do you have any ideas there? Yeah,
for instance, if we look at the previous slide where we had the different types of carbon markets, we can start looking at each one of them. For instance, compliance market is much easier to see the link between policies and the impact that you can have on demand in compliance markets. Basically, if you say something is mandatory, then it has a direct impact. But even if the EU, for instance, or the US or the UK don't plan to include removals in the short term, this is not necessarily bad. I think we should prioritize emission reductions as much as possible. But one thing that helps a lot to project developers, for instance, is having certainty on the inclusion of emission removals in policy. Because essentially, everything that is not included, that is not mandatory, that is not under regulations, is open for voluntary carbon markets to be additional. So there needs to be a lot of clarity, not only in terms of removals, but also in terms of CCS, because as you can imagine, the projects that you develop for BECS, for DACs, they will share the same infrastructure as projects with emission reductions. So it is good to have a very clear understanding on the timelines, so then project developers can make decisions in the short term.
Very helpful, Oscar.
And so this is the compliance side, and the voluntary carbon market, it may seem less obvious.
Yeah.
How can policymakers influence the voluntary carbon market? But indeed, there are some indirect measures that can have a big impact. And one of them is, for instance, the carbon removal certification framework. Simply by a jurisdiction saying, the European Union, for instance, saying, hey, you know what, we believe carbon removals are an important mitigation tool. We need to develop methodologies. This is already a very useful endorsement that can help provide companies, for instance, the certainty that this is needed. And also by developing the methodologies, this will be a form of harmonization to ensure the high quality of those mitigation outcomes.
Okay. What about the role of methodologies to foster sort of the responsible adoption of CDR? Can you talk to that?
Yeah. For instance, I can speak from the perspective of my work at the CCS Plus initiative. At the CCS Plus initiative, as some of you know, what we do is we develop methodologies to quantify and certify mitigation outcomes from CCS activities, either for carbon emission reductions or for carbon removals. So this is a very technical work that we do. And the challenge that we have in CCS for developing the methodologies is huge. Already methodologies are a key aspect of projects to quantify impacts for mitigation outcomes. For instance, if you develop a forestry project, you need to make sure that you have a good baseline, that you shape for additionality, all those things to ensure the quality of projects. CCS projects have several layers of additional complexity. You have projects that share the same infrastructure, projects that involve emission reductions, emission removals. You have transboundary transportation of CO2. So just to mention a few, so as you can imagine, this is a major endeavor, developing the methodologies. The EU is getting started in this journey, and this is something that is really central for ensuring the high quality, high integrity of direct air capture and also BECCS in this case.
Final question before we turn to Oscar. I was just talking to someone about this at lunchtime. There are potentially some negative impacts of CDR, right? Some externalities or whatever it is. What's the role of policy there? And how can policy help to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And indeed, policy has been already doing some things. I will speak more of the EU case because it's the one that I know better. For instance, when it comes to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, even if the EU doesn't have yet the methodologies to quantify or to certify emission removals through BECCS, they already have very good regulations when it comes, for instance, to ensuring permanence of storage. They have the CCS directive with strict requirements for storage. They have the liability mechanism to transfer long-term liability to the state to ensure the safety of the sites. They also have the renewable energy directive that provides guidelines on the sustainable biomass sourcing. So those things are already there. We are not starting from scratch. The policymakers are already doing something. Nevertheless, there are more things that could be done. For instance, when we look at biomass, there is a substantial potential for biomass production in the EU and pretty much in all regions. But again, opening up to other regions can increase the opportunities for sustainable biomass sourcing at lower cost. And one aspect that is very interesting to me and that I don't have the answer on how to get it right yet is how to get around the challenge of tax using that much energy. From my perspective, this is a very difficult challenge. For instance, even if you use renewable energy, the question is, okay, you are using a lot of renewable energy. We already have this challenge of decarbonizing our economy, and having this additional energy need will only make things more difficult. So it's very difficult to get around this challenge, and I think for as long as we have this challenge of having to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels, this will always be a side impact in developed countries, in the US and Europe, for instance. However, one idea that I think could be interesting to explore is, again, exploring the adoption of direct air capture in places where there is a challenge of energy access. This is, for instance, the case of some projects that are being considered in Africa, I think. I don't want to do advertisement for anybody. And I'm not saying this is the solution or that this is going to work 100%, but this is an idea that has been out there. So basically, you install the projects, the direct air capture projects in those places. They still need the same energy. They need a lot of energy to run. But sometimes if you take this technology to places where there is basically no strong infrastructure for energy, bringing this energy capacity can help establish a energy sector in specific sectors. It can help create the market certainty for regions that have poor access to electricity. So this could be a way, from my perspective, in which we can turn a negative side impact into a potential side benefit.
Yeah, okay. More than a nice to have. We've got about 5 minutes left for questions, so I'd really encourage you to make the most of Oscar's time that he's got left on the podium. So raise your hand if you're interested to ask a question. Yes, lady in the front.
Hello, I'm Elena from...
Let me help you out. There you are.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Elena from the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, a Brussels-based think tank. So my question for you would be, why have you focused only on Article 6.2 and you haven't mentioned Article 6.4, for instance?
No,
Yes.
this is a great question. So for the audience to understand what is the difference between Article 6.2 and 6.4, they are basically the two tools that we have for international cooperation between countries. The main difference is that Article 6.2 is cooperation through bilateral agreements, country to country. For instance, Germany can have an agreement with Nigeria, and they agree to develop projects, let's say in Nigeria. Germany pays for them, and then Germany gets the credit. There is a transfer of the mitigation outcome to Germany. So that's 6.2, and it's the one I have been focusing on. And the other one is Article 6.4. Article 6.4 is basically a global market and regulated by the United Nations. And this, you don't need agreement between country to country, so this is a global market, essentially. And the only reason for me for focusing on Article 6.2 is because it's the one that is more readily applicable in the shorter term. Still, it faces many challenges, especially in CCS, but this is the case for also 6.4 and 6.2. So my only reason is because I see more applicability in the medium term for 6.2, but in the long term, both should be options that we should keep at our disposal.
Thanks, Oscar. Couple more questions, yes. Madame in the front.
Thank you. I'm Laurence Boiramé from Bureau Veritas. Could you give us a status on the CDR methodology and certification framework? Where do we stand today with these discussions, and when we should have the white film?
Yeah, good question, and I should call my friends, the ones they are meeting right now in Brussels for discussing the next steps for the carbon removal certification framework. So essentially, what we stand now, we have the carbon removal certification framework, and the next stage is developing the actual methodologies. This has not been done yet. So at the moment, what we have is a set of principles that the methodologies want to ensure, which is sustainability, permanence, liability mechanisms. So this is ready. Now the next step is developing the methodologies themselves. They will probably start with BECS and direct air capture because they are the ones that have a more certain role. I'm not 100% sure about this, but probably other options like enhanced watering, biochar may also be considered. But so the next step is developing the methodologies themselves. And this is not something that is done very quickly. It will take probably at least 1 or 2 years to be done.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Wim Turkenburg, Utrecht University. In one of the slides that you showed, it was indicated that if you are really going for sustainability, then the importance of BECS nullifies. It was indicated here. And I don't understand that. So maybe you can explain that. It's from a paper published in 2021.
Yeah.
You always will have biomass waste streams that can't be used in another manner than, let's say, generating energy. If you combine that with CCS, it is not negligible in my view. So that's a strange statement.
Yeah. And this is not mentioned here, but it's in one of the papers that I mentioned, right?
It was indicated here. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I can confidently comment on this because I wrote that paper. This is a paper.
Then I don't agree.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I have changed my mind regarding that. So essentially, but I can also explain what was the framework. So for this paper that I did, it was a very specific set of conditions that I defined for evaluating BECCS. And in this case, BECCS was relying on dedicated bioenergy crops to produce the potential that I estimated. So that was the only reason. And I can tell you that I have changed my mind about this. In the past, I believed, and also many scientists believe, that we need agricultural expansion to do this. That's why BECCS got very controversial in the past 2 decades. Many people just started implementing it in integrated assessment models. And then it was like a magical solution to return to 1.5 degrees at some point. But the challenge is that they relied a lot on dedicated bioenergy crops. But as you pointed out, there is a substantial amount of potential from sustainable biomass, from wastes, from residues, and even more in my latest publication, I pretty much rejected completely what I said before, because I already mentioned here that the agricultural sector holds the potential to use land much more efficiently. For instance, if we only look at one single factor, which is the consumption of animal products, as you may know, they use a disproportionately large amount of land to produce calories, to produce proteins, etc. So if we shift to more sustainable options, then there is a potential to all of a sudden have huge amounts of even dedicated potential for bioenergy crops without agricultural expansion. So even beyond the residues potential that we have now, nothing is written, I think, because a small change in this direction, which many consultancy companies already foresee for the next years, even a replacement level, for instance, of 20, 30% can have massive impact on the land that can be released and be all of a sudden available for bio crops.
Great. I hope that answers your question. And Oscar, with that, we've run out of time, so I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was very good, and we'll move on to the next one. Thank you.